Okay. Good
Hey,
evening,
welcome everybody.
everybody. Welcome, welcome.
We'll just give it maybe 30 more seconds just to give people a chance to jump in and then Jed.
Then we'll jump in. So yeah, there's two questions. Trying to tell us who you are, so we know, and if there's any way we can help you going forward, just let us know. And I see the room starting to fill in a little bit, in a little plateau. But let's give it a few more seconds, and then we'll jump into our deck. Okay. All right. I think we're starting to hit a plateau. All right. So. Let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. Tonight's topic is college admissions testing. And what do you have to know? I am Jed Applerouth of Applerouth Tutoring. Very happy to be here tonight. Uh,
I'm Drew from Summit Educational Group. And again, thanks everybody for joining. I hope the information we're going to present is helpful for you.
I'm Adam Alouche. I'm Director of Testing here at ESM Prep. Excited to be here. And as always, Jed and Drew, excited to nerd out about these tests with you for the umpteenth time.
let's do it. Let's bring the nerd power. Awesome. All right, so let's dive in. A couple notes. If you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A little window, and we'll be able to field those, address those. We are definitely going to have time for Q&A at the end. This is a shorter deck than I certainly ever use. So we're being very efficient, very economical to make sure there's time for all of your questions. And we are doing a recording of this, and there will be a recording sent out to you for actually the majority of folks are going to be watching it tomorrow, the next day, over the weekend. But feel free to watch it again, share it. You'll get that link very soon once I play tomorrow. All right, the agenda. We have 6 points on the agenda. First thing is, well, what's changed with testing? And there have been changes that are quite meaningful and quite impactful. Then we'll go into the conversation about which test, SAT, ACT, some of the differences, some similarities. Then we'll go into the structure of when, the timeline for prepping, best time to prep, thinking about that. Then we go into the question of why tests still matter, why are colleges bringing these back. Things are definitely changing, you may have noticed. And then how can scores help you in this process for admission? And then what is the best path going forward? And think about your plan, testing plan, and strategy for the coming year. All right, let's jump right in. So let's talk about things, what's changed in testing. There are definitely been some good changes. All right, next slide is going to be the definitions. And there are four primary ways that colleges do testing. The first one, the vast majority is test optional. That's roughly some 2,000 colleges of the 4 years. And you can submit testing or not, and it'll be a complete application. They'll review your application. But test scores still may have an impact, even though it's optional. Then there are test required schools. That is the fastest growing group. The number of every month or two, we're hearing about new schools going back test required, especially the schools that are very selective. So that is, we'll talk about those and why they're going back. Then you have the shrinking list is the test blind or test free list. It's mostly in California. There are about 60 some schools, but the University of California may be soon leaving that group and potentially going back to even test required, which we'll discuss in a little bit. And then you have the test flexible list, and that Yale actually just left that group, and now they're in test required. But you still have NYU, and you have beyond Comp Sci, you have Carnegie Mellon giving some options at submitting all your APs or all your IBs in lieu of the SAT or the ACT. So those are the different options that colleges have for testing. All right, next up. Now, test optional. So the whole thing is for a time, there was a real concern or question of what does it mean? Is testing important? When you have the option, does it really make a difference? Is it neutral? And you choose, and again, they'll evaluate your app with or without test scores. But ultimately, you have to decide, do I think testing is going to be a net positive, an asset, and strengthen my application? And if it's a strength, I should certainly include it. But sometimes without testing, they're going to read it a little bit differently. And for certain schools, especially those that are very selective, it might have a meaningful impact to submit without test scores. Okay, next slide. Now, in terms of the landscape, The SAT right now is, without question, the dominant test in the US. They have recovered very well since the pandemic, and about 2/3 of kids in the country are taking this thing during the school day. So when they went, recently to a 2 hour and 14-minute test, that became much more popular, much easier to administer between 8 and 10:30 in the morning, and then go on with the school day. So that's a real boon for them. The ACT has been struggling to regain the traction they had before the pandemic. And looking at this graph, back in 2016, they were, the dominant test. They have since lost that. They went from, 2.1 million students to about 1.3 and a half, and they've been creeping along. They were briefly sold to Nexus Capital. That's a group out in Los Angeles, it's private equity. Then they were recently purchased by ETS, who they were used to be partners with, and now ETS and College Board, ETS and the ACT are going to be going together going forward. So that's kind of the graphic, but that's for us at ESM, at Applerouth, at Summit, about 2/3 of our kids are taking the SAT because that's the national trend. Though ACT, don't count it out. It's still in there. All right, next slide. Now this next slide shows you that the test return phenomenon, it's gaining traction. We now have every single Ivy League school is now test required. Even after some, like Columbia announced they be test optional forever, they have reverse position. The same thing as other schools that were test blind, not test required. Caltech was test blind, now they're test required. We see many others going back in, Stanford, Rice, MIT, Georgetown, Carnegie Mellon, many engineering schools in the mix there. And then the flagship publics. Florida never dropped because they're tied scholarships to their testing. And then Georgia came back in 2021. And the past year we had the Alabama schools, Auburn, Alabama, UT Austin went back a few years ago, Tennessee. So we're seeing the growth of Ohio State. There's a lot of movement here, and we're going to see more schools in the South and beyond going back test required over time. All right, next slide. Now, there's been a lot of press. It's been almost impossible to miss all the stories taking place about the University of California. It's been national news. Now you have petitions signed by roughly 3,000 professors at the University of California, and they are not at all happy with being test blind. And what they're seeing is a real decline in the quality of the student body. And the professors are very upset because they're having to allocate so much more time handling math students who can't do algebra and verbal kids who can barely write a sentence. So that's part of the content. Here, we saw that the number of kids requiring remedial math at UC San Diego increased 24 times, which is insane. And so the teachers are having to put so much energy into helping kids who just can't do basic math. And it's kind of clogging up the pipes of higher level calculus classes when they can't do algebra. They can't do some basic math. And these kids in remediation, what's really troubling is a quarter of these kids who can't do basic math had 4 O's in high school, which is pointing towards the grade inflation problem, where kids can get a 4.0 in honors, and then they go to college and they can't do middle school math. That's a problem. And so even at Berkeley, one of the most prestigious, esteemed public schools in the US, about a quarter of the kids are showing severe deficits in preparation for mathematics. And an English prof at Berkeley said, I'm getting students at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, of all places, that's like, UVA or, Chapel Hill, who cannot write a sentence. So we have problems. And that's something where testing is helping guard against kids who have high grades because of grade inflation, but have low skills. So there's a real push to get testing back. They are going to have the timeline be accelerated and trying to look at how fast can we get testing back. Not this year, but it might affect rising sophomores. It was going to be rising freshmen, but now it looks like they're trying to accelerate this. They're not going to pull the rug out and have announced in July, hey, it's required for October. But most likely, I'd be surprised if they don't reinstate testing for rising sophomores. All right, next slide. Now, the majority of enrolled students at some of these very, very top schools that are test optional, they are kids who sent test scores. So you look at Duke. The question is, does Duke care about testing? Well, they are officially they are test optional, no question. But 3/4 of the kids who are walking on Duke's campus sent test scores in, and only a quarter of kids walking on Duke's campus didn't send test scores, which tells you something about the importance of test scores at Duke. Same thing at Chapel Hill, same thing at UVA and Chicago. Only under a quarter of kids who got into Chicago and enrolled didn't have test scores. Same thing with Emory. And we're watching this number increase. That Emory number was 60%, 64%. It keeps creeping upward. And I wouldn't be surprised if all these numbers eventually go into the 80s. And one thing we found over the years, whenever you get over 70%, for the majority of schools who cross that threshold, they go test required within a few years. So I'm waiting for Emory. I wouldn't be surprised if Virginia goes, if Chapel Hill goes next. So it's kind of indicating that testing at these schools, which it's optional, is still quite impactful. All right, next slide, please. And I'm going to hand things off now to Drew.
All right, thanks, Jed. So with that, a little bit of context in terms of kind of why we're all here tonight, in terms of why we're talking about the testing and why the testing is still and increasingly on everybody's radar. I'm just going to do a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of what the standardized testing landscape actually looks like. So as I dive into this discussion, I'll start by talking about the PSAT. So the PSAT, most juniors will take it. It's often offered at their school during the school day. Some schools will offer it on a Saturday administration in October of their junior year. But the PSAT, it really is just practice for that SAT. Colleges do not see PSAT scores. They're not making admission decisions based on PSAT scores. Anytime students get an opportunity to take an official test under real conditions, especially when it doesn't really count for anything, it's always good practice for them. So for our juniors, for our high-scoring juniors, the PSAT, it is part of the NMSQT, or the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test program. But just note, it's less than 1% of students nationally who are going to be recognized as a National Merit semifinalist or a finalist. It's an incredibly competitive competition. So for our high-scoring students who just maybe might miss that cutoff, please do not panic about that. It is not going to negatively impact your college admission process. Obviously, if you get that scholarship, you will cash the check. I will say, not to depress all of us, but that check or that award has not been adjusted for inflation since its inception. It used to cover like full year of like books, room and board, tuition. It covered everything. Now maybe it covers books. It's $2,500. Obviously, if your student gets it, you'll cash the check because every little bit helps. But it's not like you've missed out on some like $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 award. There are some schools out there, just to be aware of this, who might increase the merit aid award that they might offer to a student if they are a National Merit semifinalist or finalist. But again, for the most part, it's absolutely not going to impact your student's application process. But in addition to giving students practice on taking a standardized test, giving them a little bit more familiar with the format of the SAT and the type of questions that they're going to see, the students do get a score back. It does highlight relative strengths and weaknesses, so it is a great kind of first step as students are thinking about standardized testing to get a baseline score and also start just, again, getting a better feel in terms of what their strengths and weaknesses are. I always tell our juniors when they get their PSAT scores back, please do not panic. If that score came back a little bit lower than what you were hoping or what you were expecting, performance on these tests, it does correlate with age, maturity, and time spent in school. Everything that students are doing day in and day out in school is helping them prepare for these tests. So where students start on a PSAT and where they ultimately end up on an SAT or even an ACT for that matter is often two different places. But it does give students a baseline score. It does give you a general sense in terms of kind of where they're starting in this process. Okay, so now as we start doing a deeper dive in terms of the standardized tests, the two major tests that the colleges are looking for are either the SAT, as Jed mentioned, or the ACT. I will point out, we know that the SAT, from Jed's slide, It is kind of winning the market share battle. Roughly 2/3 of students nationally are choosing the SAT path versus the ACT path. But colleges do accept both these tests equally. They do not have a preference for one test over the other. They do not see one test as a superior test, the other test as an inferior test. They are accepted equally. So at the end of the day, it's really up to your student to decide, hey, do I want to go down an SAT path or do I want to go down an ACT path? And as Jed mentioned in his intro, there have been some changes to the standardized testing landscape and to the test. The major change that has been implemented for the SAT is it is a shorter test now. So it's 2 hours and 14 minutes. It is purely online. So students will take this test digitally. And it has moved to an adaptive format. And I'll walk you through in a minute kind of how that adaptive scoring works, just so you have a better understanding of what that means. But it's still on that same 200 to 800 scale that many of us knew and loved growing up. So 200 to 800 on verbal, 200 to 800 on math. So even though it's gone to this digital adaptive format, it's still on that 400 to 1600 point scale. And I will say also that the PSAT, it also is a adaptive digital test. It has the exact same format as the SAT that I will show you. And the SAT, Adam will get into this in a little bit. It is offered multiple times throughout the year, so students do have multiple opportunities to take this test. All right, so as I mentioned, one of the recent changes that the SAT made is it moved to this digital adaptive structure. So I just want to walk you through this just so you have a better understanding in terms of how the scoring of this works. And I will say the PSAT has the exact same structure as the SAT. So what I'm talking about for the SAT is also going to apply for the PSAT, so students also get some practice in that. But on the verbal, so the verbal, the reading and writing, I'm just going to call that verbal. It's divided up into 2 sections. I'm going to call them modules, so module 1 and module 2. And then on the math is also divided up into 2 modules. So module 1 on the math and then module 2 on the math. And what students are going to see in that first module is, think of this as being like a heat map of level of difficulty of questions. So in that first module, and this is true of both the verbal first module and the math first module, what students are going to get is they're going to see some easy questions. They're going to get some middle level questions. They're going to get some hard questions. They're going to get some of the hardest questions on this test. And then, depending on how well students do in that first module, the test is going to send them to one of 2 second modules. So let's say a student did quote well on that first module. And we think by doing well, it's answering about 60+% of the questions correctly. So they don't have to be perfect on it. But if a student answers about 60% of those questions correctly, once they've completed that first module, the test knows that that's how they've done. And based on that student's performance, what the test has figured out is that this student is somewhere in the 450 to 800 point range. But it doesn't know where in that range that student is. Is this a 450, a 550, a 650, a 750, or even an 800 level student? So in this quote harder second module, kind of as the name implies, what students are going to get to try to figure out where in that range that student is they're going to get hard questions, harder questions, some of the hardest questions in this range on this test to figure out where in that range that student is. Let's say a student struggled a little bit with that first module. Let's say they answered about 50% of the questions correctly. Again, when they completed the first module, the test knows that that's how they've done. And based on that performance, what the test has figured out is that this student is somewhere in the 200 to low 600 point range. But again, they don't know where in that range that student is. So in this easier second module, again, as the name implies, what students are going to get is they're going to get easy questions, mostly middle level questions. There might be the occasional hard question or 2 to figure out where in that range that student is. Just note, if a student ends up in that easier second module, their score is going to be capped. So we think the highest score that they can get is somewhere in that 620 to 630 range. Now, going into the PSAT and going into the SAT, students know that this test has this adaptive structure, but our general advice to them is don't worry about it. So even though the test knows which second module they are sending the student when they've completed that first module, it is not going to tell the students. So the student has no idea when they get into that second module, if they're in the harder module or the easier module. And I just don't want students wasting any mental energy trying to guess which second module that they are in. I'd much rather have them stay in the moment, focus on the questions that are in front of them, answer as many of those questions as they can correctly, because that's how they're going to maximize their score. Also note, when students get their PSAT score back or their SAT scores back, it's also not going to say on that on that score report whether students got sent to the harder module or the easier module, because there is some overlap in scoring. You can see it, especially in that 450 to low 600 point range. So if a student, for instance, got a 550 on their SAT math, they could have gotten that 550 by going to the harder module. They could have gotten a 550 by going to the easier module. It does not matter. A 550 is a 550 regardless of which second module that student went to. And also on the official score reports that you send on to colleges, if you send an SAT score report to a college, it's also not going to say whether a student went to that harder module or that easier module. But this is how the SAT was able to shorten their test. So the previous iteration of the SAT, it was a paper and pencil test. It was a 3-hour test. But with this section, what they call section adaptive structure, they've been able to get it down to a 2-hour and 14-minute test, but still have a valid test and still have it on that same 200 to 800 point scale. So I did just want to take a minute just to walk you through the adaptive scoring of that SAT, because it can lead sometimes to a little bit of confusion in terms of how that works. Now, I already mentioned this, but the other option that students have is the ACT. ACT is still very much kind of a paper and pencil test. It is not moving to this adaptive scoring structure. And if you're not familiar with the ACT, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's divided up into a number of different sections. There's an English section, that's just the grammar portion of the test. There's a math section, there's a reading section. There's this optional science section. The science, one of the tweaks that the ACT made to try to compete with that shorter SAT was to make the science section optional. That science ACT, it's not science per se. It's not like what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis. It's more of a deductive reasoning exercise than anything. It's really more of reading comprehension. Students are given scientific passages. They might not know anything about that passage. And then they're asked, in the time that they have, can they find the information they need to answer those questions? It's more of a scavenger hunt, really, than anything. So the ACT, it's also offered digitally. But again, if students take it digitally, it's the exact same test that they would take paper and pencil. The difficulty of the ACT comes from the pace of it. So the SAT is more of what we call a power test, just harder reading, some trickier questions on that SAT, just a little bit more misdirection on the SAT, trying to make things seem a little bit harder than they actually are. Whereas the ACT, the difficulty comes from the pace of it. The reading's a little bit easier, the questions are a little bit more straightforward, but students have to work at a very fast pace. It's almost a total sprint from start to finish. So can students actually get through the test in that time allotted? In terms of the scoring of it, if you're not familiar with the ACT, it's on a 1 through 36 scale. What colleges will see is they'll see the individual section scores. So they'll see an English score, the math score, and the reading score, and the science if students opt to take it. And then they'll also see an overall composite score. Now, with the science being optional, that overall composite score is just the average of the English, math, and reading scores. Now, with the science being optional, if students end up going down the ACT path, our general advice to students is, at this point, if you take the ACT, try to take the ACT with science at least once. That way you have a science score if you need it. I will say almost all schools at this point are test optional, but there are a few out there that are still recommending it. Duke, for instance, is still recommending the science. I think Marquette is still, even though they're test optional, is still requiring science if you take, or if you submit an ACT score. And that recommendation from us, it's more of a hedge than anything. I'd rather have you have a science score and ultimately maybe not need it than take the ACT without the science, have a specific program or a specific school that's looking for it. And now maybe you're scrambling to take the ACT one more time just for the sake of that optional science score. All right. So here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the two tests. Again, with the science being optional, you can see in terms of length of time, they're very comparable. If students take the ACT with science, it's going to add another 40 minutes to the test, so a little bit longer, 2 hours and 45 minutes as compared to 2 hour and 14 minutes. Again, we talked about the SAT having this newer adaptive scoring structure. ACT is still very much what we call a linear test. Every question's worth the same. It does not have, this adaptive structure to it. On the math and the test in general, again, SAT, just a little bit more of a power test, a little bit trickier questions, a little bit more misdirection, whereas the ACT, longer reading passages, and students just really have to move through it quickly in order to get through the test. I'll come back to this point in terms of kind of sometimes we get the question of, all right, Drew, so, which test, SAT or ACT? So I'll come back to that in a minute. So when I talk about that power versus speed, I just want to show you just two quick examples from reading questions from these tests, just to highlight kind of the differences in the philosophy between these two tests. So the SAT, when it moved to this adaptive format, in addition to going to an online test, it also kind of on the reading and on their grammar questions, it sort of redefined what a passage is. So on the SAT, passages are no longer these long essays that students need to fight their way through. They're much shorter now, generally one paragraph or two. And then there's only one question per passage. But just because the passages got shorter on the SAT, it doesn't mean it got easier. Being a power test, it still requires a close reading, analytical reading, almost a line-by-line reading of this passage in order to be able to answer this question. Again, here's an excerpt from a 19th century British novel that students need to fight their way through. This is what it looks like on the ACT reading. Passages are much longer. This is about a third of what the passage actually is. It didn't fit on the slide, so this is truncated. And just to give you a feel in terms of how fast that ACT is. So students are going to get 4 passages, 9 questions per passage, so 36 questions in total. And students only have 40 minutes to get through that entire section. So again, just gives you a sense in terms of how fast that ACT reading is. So again, back to that point. All right, Drew. So we know colleges accept both tests equally. So which one's the better one for my student? Should we go SAT? Should we go ACT? And the recommendations I put here, they're just kind of like top line, just sort of like general recommendations to think about. At the end of the day, really the best way to make this decision is to try both tests, ideally in a practice setting. And you can reach out to us. It's a great, especially for our rising juniors, if they have time over the summer, to do a practice SAT, do a practice ACT. It's a great way for students to get baseline scores, but more importantly, kind of what's their gut instinct. Are we more SAT? Are we more ACT? Because keep in mind, roughly 70 to 80% of students are going to score equally well on both. So having exposure to both in that practice setting can be really, really helpful in terms of helping students decide, do I feel more comfortable with the SAT or do I feel more comfortable with that ACT? And again, definitely don't hesitate to reach out to us to have your students take those practice tests. All right. Adam, I think I'm kicking this to you.
Thank you, Drew. All right, so when should we start preparing for these tests? Before I get into a timeline on the next slide, I really want to stress that this timeline, the way to prep, really does change for every student. There's not one way to do this. I know sometimes we get blanket advice from our school because it's easier to tell all 200 sophomores at the same time to take it, to start prepping here, take it there. But this really does depend on a few key factors that we'll go into in the next few slides. Next slide, please, Drew. So the first thing that you want to make sure that you've covered before you start planning is that you finish Algebra 2 or are expecting to finish it soon. Algebra 2 is the last class or the hardest math class tested on both the SAT and the ACT. It's what the average college-bound junior takes in high school, and so that's the hardest math that they'll see. And so you generally want to finish Algebra 2 or kind of dead end this into finishing Algebra 2 so that you don't have to learn all of the math necessary for either of these tests in prep or on your own. You can naturally cover the concepts in school and then work on how they're applied and work on the strategies that surround them during test prep. So that Algebra 2 class is really the conceptual benchmark we're looking for. And then there's a lot of other things you want to consider with your child. Maturity level, their ability to take on this responsibility. If you're thinking that you want them to test early, but the kid is really just kind of butting up against starting this early and saying, well, my friends are all doing this next summer. Why do I have to do this summer? You generally need to get a kid's buy-in to make the most of this. This is not just an investment of money and time. Mainly it is an investment of money and time, but we want to just also not get them really starting this off on the wrong foot, right? If they're not invested, it can just really prolong this process and make it pretty painful, in the worst cases. So what I also want to point out about these years is that the time in the margins between these 3 years is actually almost more important than the time spent in these years, especially the time before sophomore and junior year. So how you spend your summers during this process is vital. So as a sophomore, you want to learn about these tests. You want to watch webinars like this one. You want to hear what your parents have to say about these tests. Maybe talk to your older siblings and just hear about their differences when they're given, and then work towards taking the PSAT if you can take it, whether it's in October for some schools, sometimes it's in April or March, and then dead end into a diagnostic test or tests, as Drew said. Diagnostic tests are vital. Drew laid out all the merits for the PSAT. I'm going to take the devil's advocate side for a second and say that they aren't the perfect diagnostic test. So many parents come to us saying, well, I don't need to take diagnostics, but here's my pre-ACT, here's my PSAT. Those are just snapshots, and comparing them where those scores are in the moment doesn't help you project where those scores are going to get. And so with diagnostics, you get question by question feedback on what concepts your students are missing, where their timing is, and you can really build out a plan from those and project the path to improvement rather than just comparing, well, my ACT score on my test that is 10 points away from where I wanted to be was 1 point concordance higher than my SAT score, so I'm going to take the ACT. You really want that detailed analysis to make the best decision for your student. If you do that at the end of the sophomore year, then if they've taken Algebra 2 and you want to get this done early just to distribute the overall workload of the college process, many students tend to prepare diligently for these tests the summer before junior year and try to take these tests in the fall semester or early spring semester of their junior year. That allows them to try to finish this before AP exams start, before final exam starts for that all-important junior year GPA. You can kind of fit this into the time of the most relative free time that a student's going to have after sophomore year, because we all remember it gets very busy fast. Junior year is insane in the workload that students have, the other extracurriculars, sports, and then the summer before senior year, you add on all of that, applications, the reality of this process kind of coming to a head and knowing what you need. And so using that summer before junior year, if you've taken Algebra 2, can help you use the most free time you're going to have to get ahead in this process. As junior year comes around, you want to choose your tests. You want to look at your diagnostics, go over the path to improvement, go over how you feel about them, and choose one test. I know we saw a question in the chat that we're going to cover here, but you don't need to take both of these tests. There's actually not an advantage to taking the SAT and the ACT. Some schools actually see it as a disadvantage to submit both of these. If you submit fantastic SAT and ACT scores and you have 99 percentile scores on both, but you have a 3.2 GPA, an admissions officer is going to look at you and say, man, what were you doing? You spent all these times taking these tests when you could have been studying. You don't have any extracurriculars. And so taking one of these tests, focusing on it, giving it your all is what we recommend. So like I said, junior year is the time to try to finish this as early as realistic, given all the constraints that you have in your schedule, both in school and out of school, and then retest if needed. We generally say to plan for 3 and hope for 2 is one of my favorite phrases, but I would actually extend that longer now for the SAT in particular. We're seeing students take the SAT more and more times because one thing that is a subtle, very big importance to the SAT is that they don't tell you how you got your score. Because of the algorithmic adaptive scoring that Drew laid out, you don't know how many points you missed for a certain question. You actually don't know how many questions you missed in the section overall. So it's a little bit of a black box. Like most students that do prep get into the higher module, but after that, they're like, okay, I thought that test went great. Why is my score not where it needs to be? Why isn't it where I got it in practice? And you kind of have to use your own anecdotal experiential evidence to kind of put the pieces together and see how maybe you missed some points, because you get really not a lot of great data from those official SATs. And so we're seeing students take the SAT more and more as a result. Some students will take it 4 or even 5 times. If you need to, if you haven't hit that mark, if you're dead set on going to school X or this tier of school and they're all requiring tests now, as Jed laid out, you should retest and use that summer before senior year to really move the needle. If you're not quite sure where their score lies, it's a great opportunity to go talk to your school counselor to see, how do I fit? How do I fit not only at this school's percentiles, but as students that have gone to our school and applied to fit. And they'll give you really the best possible advice that you can get on whether you should continue testing or not based on your school list. And then at the end, submit your strongest scores. Most colleges don't require you to submit all your scores. There's only a few now. Georgetown is the one that we always mention as a school that has done it forever, but just because they haven't changed the policy in decades. That might happen soon. We'll see. Schools generally don't care how many times you take this test. In fact, both the ACT and the SAT allow you to submit only some of your official scores to colleges. So there's, for the SAT, we use what's called their score choice platform. You can submit really only two scores. The one that has your highest verbal, the one that has your highest math. For the ACT, it's the 3. And so schools really want to evaluate you at your highest score possible, because when they admit you, that makes them look better. That brings their average test scores up. And so they're going to look at that highest score. They're not going to, on that first read where they only have a couple minutes to read your application, kind of nitpick over how many times you took it. All right, next slide, please. So how to build this plan. We went over a bit of this, but I'll just cover a couple extra things here. So start with a diagnostic. We said take both, always take both. Make sure that you are understanding the basics of how to take this test by watching webinars like this, by talking to somebody at school or somebody from one of our companies to understand kind of what to do to get the most out of that. The biggest mistake you can make on a diagnostic is going in completely cold on not the concepts, but how to take it on a basic test taking mindset. So what we see most of all is students that just take way too much time early on, and they just have half the tests that they don't get to. If you know that there's no penalty for guessing on these tests, and you know that you should just go and skip, it's actually your best interest to skip questions and do everything you know how to do and try to get to the end, you have the most accurate sample with which to make this decision. And so just do a little bit of background research and make sure that you're taking these tests in the right frame of mind with the right basic skills so that you can really compare these two tests. After that, you want to create a plan. Like I said, that depends on so many variables. Are you a recruited athlete? It's a big one we see. Do you have an accommodation situation that requires you to wait a little bit longer? Do you have a PSAT score or a diagnostic score of 1,000, which is about a little bit under average, but you have a 4.0 and you've been dead set on going to an Ivy League school your whole life? Just how long you have to go can really extend that timeline or reduce it if you have a fantastic diagnostic score and it's pretty much where you want your score to be long-term. And then adjust your timeline if you need improvement. You have to be flexible in this process, and that's why we recommend starting early. The only thing that runs out here is time. You have to take a test by December of your senior year for regular, and October or November, depending on the school, for early decision. And so if you start this too late, you'll have to cram, you won't be able to break that improvement that you really want to get the score that's going to really benefit you in this process. And that's step 3, practice, review, and adjust. Take multiple practice tests. Most of our students take at least 3 practice tests, if not more, throughout this process. It is the best thing that you can do in this process to get ready for these tests, especially on the SAT, I find, paradoxically, because of how much they penalize mistakes. And so taking practice tests, making sure you're focusing on getting every question right, not just obsessing over the ones that were hard for you, is really, really important. Practicing getting in the right mindset for these tests so that you're making the same decisions when it counts that you were in these practice tests is vital. Review every mistake. Mistakes are huge. Also, you have to review every question that you weren't 100% confident you did the right way. I think that's the number one thing we teach our tutors early on, is that you can't just go over everything you got wrong. You have to go over every opportunity there was where there was some amount of indecision or doubt, because those are the ones that even if you get them right, if you have that situation on the test, it's going to linger even if you had that right answer. You're going to doubt yourself if you didn't know that you made the right decision from a test taking perspective on that question. As a result, you're refining your strategy. And then, yes, like we said, schedule a retake or multiple retakes if needed. All right, next slide, please. Common mistakes. I was nice to limit myself to 5 here. I might add a couple on the end here. We already talked about waiting too late. Again, if you wait till the spring of your junior year to even start planning this, and you're a spring sport, you have play a spring sport, you know your GPA is on the borderline, you have a lot of B pluses that need to be A minuses, you're really putting all of your eggs in the summer before senior year, and you're limiting the number of times you can test, right? If you are doing that, you can take 4 SATs before early, only 3 if you could take the July test on the ACT. So you just run out of opportunities to do this before your time's up. Taking both the SAT and the ACT without a strategy, like we said, don't take both of these tests. It's just, I've tutored these tests for 15 years. I've done this for 15,000 hours. I would never on my worst enemy, subject them to taking both of these for no reason. Only the sickos like us that love doing this stuff kind of will do that for fun, but nobody should have to do that. There are kids that sometimes switch, especially this year. We've seen more kids switch from the SAT to this newer enhanced ACT that has kind of hit a wall on the SAT and are, because they don't know what they're missing, or just kind of in the dark about why they can't get over the hump to get their score. So we have seen more kids switch from the SAT to ACT this year. That's something you should definitely discuss the merits of, but we definitely don't recommend taking both of these tests and preparing fully for both. Like we said, don't start this in earnest before Algebra 2. If you're a junior taking Algebra 2 and you want to be recruited for sports that really need a score, there are ways to kind of get around that, where you focus on the verbal components early on and you kind of work, delay the math a bit until you've covered it. But you generally do need to finish Algebra 2 to test at your highest on these math sections. And then focusing only on content instead of test taking strategies. This is probably the most important one. I think, Jed, you said so many great things about why the UCs are rethinking reinstating tests. We have had so many students over the last 5 years, and parents most of all actually, come to us talking about their juniors after taking the PSAT and just complete disbelief about how their kid that has a 4.0 and has never gotten below an A in math got a 490 on their PSAT math.
Yeah.
Our instruction really since COVID, but is not tailor-made for these tests, especially the SAT, where they, as Drew said, they really flexibly and creatively stretch these applications that all these students have taught, when our math is taught so iteratively at even the best schools in the country now. So we have so many kids that are used to just learning one thing in math, regurgitating it on a test, moving on, getting their A, and not really internalizing it, that really struggle on the SAT and ACT math. And so focusing on the strategies around that, both on how to use things like Desmos on the SAT or on the digital ACT, or you taking a multiple choice test where you don't get those style points, you're not losing half points for flipping a minus sign like you are in school, is really, really important. And that's even before we go into how to make sure you're managing your anxiety, how you make sure you are giving it your best and being able to focus and channel those things to do your best on the test. All of these things kind of combine into making this a very, very different test than anything you've done at school. And then not leaving time for a retake. Again, don't wait too late. Don't start this August before senior year, assuming you can cram. It's going to be a really stressful experience. And as somebody that did that to their parents for applications, not for the test, but for applications, I really don't recommend it. All right, next slide.
Okay.
You.
Yeah, thanks. So just briefly, we talked before that test scores are being required at more and more schools, and that trend will continue this year. We're going to see probably 6, 7 new schools popping back with requirements. And the question is why? What are they getting from this? Let's go on to the next slide and look at some of the data. And the Opportunity Insight study, I was Raj Chetty, future Nobel laureate out of Harvard, and with colleagues at Harvard and beyond, they ran some data on the 12 schools that are the Ivies plus four. It's Duke, MIT, Chicago, and Stanford. And they ran the numbers for these kids going to great schools. What predicts performance freshman year? And they found that testing is a very nice, clean, strong correlation. As test scores go up at a 1200, kids had a 3.2 at these schools. At a perfect score, they had a 3.68. It's a nice, strong trend. Compare that to GPA on the right side. Kids who scored a 3.1 in high school with their cumulative GPA in college, they got a 3.46. Those with a 4.0 in high school, they ended up with a 3.54. So that was a very weak correlation. It turns out high school grades are not a good predictor of performance at these top schools. This isn't to say this holds up at every school in the country. These were 12 very elite schools where testing was was a much stronger predictor of performance. And that led to the beginning of schools, and especially in the Ivies and Ivy Plus, saying, wait a minute, test scores actually really do matter. They shouldn't be optional. They should be required. Next slide. And things began to move from there, from Dartmouth and beyond. Now, the other piece here is looking at since the pandemic and beyond, look at what's happened with grades. And grades, we are seeing that's going to be on the right scale. The from in 1995, where kids had a 2.75, and year by year the grades have been ticking up, up, up. After COVID, boom, we're now with 3.4 is now the average grade, and A is becoming average. Compare that to testing. Testing hasn't gone up. In fact, looking at where it was in the 21 for ACT, it's now at an average score of a 19.5. So testing is dropping, where standardized measures of achievement are falling versus grades are rising. So we're seeing a decoupling of what kids actually know from the grades they're getting in high school, which is showing up when they're going to college and the UCs and they can't do math and they can't write sentences, even though their grades are very, very strong. So this slide here is showing you the problem with rising grades, not coupled with rising attainment and on achievement tests. Next slide. And then here we have the schools themselves. I look at Yale, bottom right corner. Test scores are the single best predictor that we have for grades at Yale. That was Jeremiah Quinlan, and that's when they made testing required. At Dartmouth, they went back first. High school GPA explains a lot less than testing alone. That was we showed on the graph before. Also at Brown, test scores are a much better predictor of success than high school grades. At Texas, that's one of the large flagships, that test submitters had much higher GPAs on average. We're talking about 0.86 grade points higher than kids without testing. So we're talking about in the middle of freshman year at Texas, kids who sent test scores, let's say they had a 3.5, and those who didn't on average had a 2.64. And we're much more likely to go on probation academically and fail out of Texas. So test scores are doing a lot at these elite schools and at a school like UT Austin. And after UT Austin went, we saw Ohio State, and all these schools are going, and there are, Auburn, Alabama, there are a lot more coming. So we're seeing at schools that are very selective, test scores are doing a lot, which is the reason we're going to see more requirements coming back in the next few years. All right, next slide. All right, Adam.
All right, so the benefits of strong scores. I think, next slide, please. The most obvious one that we're going to go into in a bit and see some data on is that it really does strengthen your application. I teach the LSAT a bit on the side when I'm not doing SAT and ACT. And when they came out in the beginning of COVID with test optional, it was the lines that they would say is it can be an advantage to submit a test score, but we're not going to and everybody else at the side of the mouth would say, we're not going to disadvantage you if you don't submit a test score. And the logical fallacy there is, well, if I'm competing with people that are taking test scores and submitting high ones and I have everything else the same, but I don't submit a score, and there's 10 kids that did, you're going to take one of those kids. And we're seeing that a lot, especially at the most elite areas of the country. If you're a New York City private school kid or in the Bay Area or LA, you're really competing with those kids around you in your same socioeconomic background. They go to the same type of schools from you. And those kids are taking tests at a really high rate. And so the best thing it can do is increase your chances at the most competitive universities. It demonstrates readiness for college level work. Jed, you just summed it up perfectly. It just is a better predictor than grades in this day and age. And then it is very valuable for competitive and STEM focused majors where some of them have additional requirements for these tests or a higher standard in some schools for those test scores. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit of data. This data is a bit older than, anywhere from 3 to 5 years. The main thing here is because they didn't realize some of these places were giving us this data by accident. They were giving us all of the components to determine these things right when COVID hit, when test optional was pretty new. We were able to actually determine the admit rates of students that submitted and didn't. So all of these, as you can see, we're just submitting so many more, exponentially more students with test scores than weren't. And this is actually not even telling the full story, because a lot of the kids that were getting in test optional in some of these schools were athletes that didn't have to test, and it wasn't as big of a stress in the application. Legacies was that for a while. And so this is actually generous for the discrepancy. So that advantage is probably a little bit understated when you're talking about somebody that doesn't have a connection to the school, isn't an athletic recruit. All right, next slide, please. Drew, you touched on this about the PSAT, but you can actually get much more merit data in many schools, usually state schools, based on a high SAT score. It can help you get into honors colleges at some of our state schools. And they are these, and as opposed to that $2,500 number, Drew, that you mentioned to be a study finalist, these can be substantial. There are schools that offer full rides that consider, between GPA and weighting that test score for students. And so I remember getting into UConn because of my SAT score, and they were going to pay me to go to the honors college in 2000, and I won't admit the rest of that year. And so, like you said, all these state schools in the South and Southwest will really have robust merit packages, or aid packages, excuse me, based on the merit of your test scores. All right. You can see here, this is the University of Alabama, which has really one of the more robust packages, both for SAT score for merit base, and they have a great one for if you happen to be a semifinalist or finalist for the PSAT for national merit. You can just see the numbers here, and it can really pay for a sizable portion of your college tuition. And these numbers are going up with inflation. These numbers are being increased and becoming more competitive because these schools want the smartest kids. This is a competition in college admissions. Schools want the smartest kids to come to their schools. And the best thing that state schools can do is offer merit-based scholarships to make the price of going there much, much less than maybe some of the more prestigious schools where they're not offering as much merit-based aid. All right, the best path forward. Next slide, please. So we'll talk about this a little bit more holistically. Understand the goals in college list is vital to know where that score might need to be and whether they require scores in the first place. If you're a student that has ambitions to go to a top tier, really a top 20 or 30 school, based on the US News Report, it's going to be nearly impossible at this point to build a college list that has a school that doesn't require a test score. And so you want to look at that list. You want to talk to your school counselor about the viability of test optional, if you do have a fully test optional list or a combination of test optional and test blind, just to make sure that you do need to test and that you need to test at a certain level to be competitive at applying to those schools. Choose the SAT or ACT based on fit, not assumptions. And I would also add, don't choose the test that you just have a slightly better score on your diagnostics, right? Really get into the weeds there and make sure you don't undersell your own experience taking these tests. If you beat your SAT score by a little bit on the ACT, but you were a nervous wreck the entire time and you couldn't go at that pace, you started sweating, you still didn't finish a lot of it, even though it's slightly better, that qualitative feedback might be just more important than that extra point or so on the ACT diagnostic. Start early enough to prepare without unnecessary stress. Yes, and that doesn't mean start preparing, like sitting down with your SAT textbook or with a tutor as early as possible. It means knowing the plan and preparing for it, to know when you're going to start and to give yourself that wiggle room at the end for flexibility, for a retake, as we see there in the fourth bullet point. And then review score submission policies. You're going to want to make sure you know which schools allow you to super score or don't require you to submit all scores, which ones don't require science, or really which ones do at this point for the ACT science, because I believe right now there's only 3 that require it. It's Pomona, BU, and Georgetown. That can always change. That's the one little downside of doing this way too early, is that you have to really prepare for all of the possibilities of change and test with science. Like Drew said, you have to just cover all your bases if you're starting very early, but just make sure you know what you have to submit and what's required for each school.
All right. Let's see. We definitely have some time for questions. So,
We do.
And also just everyone, of course, you can reach out to us at any time. We encourage you to do so. But if you would like us to reach out to you directly, definitely feel free to take a moment to fill out the poll. We'll make sure one of our program directors follows up with you. But of course, you can reach out to us at any time as well. But definitely, if you are interested, please feel free to fill out the poll, and we'll make sure that one of our program directors follows up with you. All right, we definitely have some time for questions. So as you're looking at the poll, let me just see what's come in.
I think Adam has answered a couple. Been typing.
Yeah. But here's a great one. Just can you please explain more what the diagnostic test is? Adam, you want to take that one?
So a diagnostic test is just a phrase we use for a full-length SAT or a full-length ACT. We at Guidewell, we use our own that we've made that has a good mix of concepts. So you can, when you get that question by question feedback, you get to see exactly what questions you're missing, which ones you're getting right. And it gives you a score that is mimicking where you would be on that test at that given moment. And so we really recommend taking one of these full-length tests at the beginning of the process of each to compare both the experience and the scores. It really is any full-length practice test. You can take one in the Blue Book app from the College Board's official app for the SAT. The ACT releases a test a year that you can take, but it really just means a full-length practice test where you're able to grade it and see what you got right and wrong.
And we generally advise, like, reach out to us. You can do it for free with us. Like, do it in a practice setting, because sometimes the question we'll get is, oh, so should I just register for an official SAT, an official ACT? And our general recommendation is not to do that. It just kind of adds to the pressure when you're doing it officially. Like, you can get that exact same information by doing, as Adam said, a practice test under realistic conditions without that pressure of signing up for an official one.
Way better information, in fact, by doing
Yes.
practice one.
Because you can actually see the questions, which you're not going to be able to necessarily get if you do an official one. And as Adam mentioned, the score report that you'll get back, it's much more itemized, it's detailed, it's characterized by level of difficulty. You get much more information from the practice or diagnostic test than you're going to get from any official test that you take. So that's where that recommendation comes from.
You're right, Drew. It is important to not take a diagnostic SAT on your laptop while watching Netflix.
Right.
And so we do offer even scheduled ones for the ACT now that's still on paper, and taking it in a right setting where you're taking it seriously is very important.
Yep, will do. Let's see, this one just came in. We do have time for this. Adam and Jed, for students who are on 504s or IEPs, can you just talk about whether students, can take these tests with accommodations and maybe what that looks like?
Well, yeah. Adam, go ahead.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. You have to work with your school to apply for accommodations for both the College Board, who handles the SAT, as well as the PSAT and AP exams, and the ACT, which is a separate organization. Most students, by the time they're a junior, if they haven't had an IEP or a 504 in school for a while, will have their school automatically apply for College Board accommodations. But I would by no means assume that that's going to happen. If you have a kid going into the junior year and you're not sure if they've got approved for College Board accommodations, certainly email your school's learning office to ask if they've started that process and if he or she they have been approved for accommodations. The ACT, the big thing with the ACT is that you have to register for an official test with the ACT to begin the accommodations process. And so they're generally a little bit more strict for approving accommodations, especially recent ADHD diagnoses, than the College Board is, because of the time pressure of the ACT is such a limiting factor to scores, but they're a little bit more protective of giving extra time. It's something that we do recommend taking care of early in the process as part of that planning stage, because you never know what happens. If there's some box that's not checked in the process, you might get a surprise denial. You might have to appeal. It can delay it. And so definitely something you want to cover very early in the process. And honestly, if you have a student that has a 504 IEP, signing up for an ACT even before they know they're going to take it can be recommended, so that you know what the accommodations are even before going into diagnostic or even choosing the test that they're going to take officially.
And you could always you can postpone that test. So you could go in and change the registration date for it. You are not, just because you registered for a test, you're not obligated to take that test. It's not any kind of red flag or black mark if for whatever reason you end up changing that date or even just not taking it. But as Adam mentioned, that For the ACT, that is what will start that accommodation process going. And also, as Adam said, you'll work closely with your school. So if your student is on a 504 IEP or is looking for accommodations, generally there's going to be a contact person at your school who's going to help with that application process. So you just want to be in touch with them on the earlier side, just to let them know that you are going to need some help in terms of applying for these accommodations. And then lastly, just keep in mind, it's two separate tests, two separate organizations. So if students have accommodations for the PSAT, they have those same accommodations for the SAT. They also have those the same accommodations for any AP exams that they might have, but they do not have it for the ACT. Two separate tests, two separate processes. So something else just to keep in mind there. Jed, anything to add on that front?
Oh, that was great. Covered it.
I would just add that you only have to apply once.
Right.
If once you've applied them and approved, you don't have to do it for every test date or every different type of test for the College Board. It is a one-time thing where they just have to recertify them for future tests. So it's generally a pretty painless process for most people, as long as you work with your school pretty early in the process.
Yeah. Perfect. Let's see. That's all I see coming in tonight. But Jed, Adam, so great catching up with you all and talking some shop here for everyone on the call. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I hope this information was helpful for you. As Jed mentioned in his intro, we absolutely have recorded this. We will try to get that recording out to you tomorrow or early next week at the latest. But again, definitely feel free to reach out to us if you need anything, and definitely take advantage of those free practice tests that we offered, especially for our rising juniors this summer. It's kind of a great sort of first step in this process. But Jed or Adam, any closing thoughts here as we wrap up?
No, look forward to more news and the saga at UC. It's always exciting, but they're shaking up in there in our space. It's kind of fun. So,
All right.
Nothing from
All right,
me.
y'all.
All
Have a
right.
good
Thanks,
night.
everybody. So appreciate your taking the time. Enjoy the rest of your evening.